Hey everyone, how's everyone doing out there? I thought I would do another video. This is Mike Yao with Savage Kingdoms role-playing game and Fire in the Head Productions, my little tiny press company, game production company. And yeah, so hopefully you're staying safe and sane out there in your self-quarantine. Hopefully you're doing that if you can, or if you're supposed to be. If not, well, more power to you. Some of us are still stuck here, although it's nice to walk out and around in the mountains, and it's been a very beautiful spring. Don't forget that spring is still happening around you, even though you're sort of, quote, trapped, unquote, inside, because it's actually been a very impressive spring so far, I think. Maybe it just seems all the greater because, a lot of us are sort of stuck inside. But yeah, don't forget that stuff's going on in the background. All right, but today's video is not really about that per se. Today's video is about Savage Kingdoms and how it differs from other tabletop role-playing games. So, thought I would do this for the Indiegogo crowd, but also I'll probably put it maybe on the website as well and possibly on the Facebook page, etc. Yada yada. And please subscribe and share this video. I'm really, there's only like a handful of people who watch these things, so let's try to get the numbers up there and get the brand awareness out there. I'd really appreciate it. That would be awesome. So, how is it different? Actually, let me start with this premise or this synopsis. How is it different? Well, first of all, it's saying it's not, in the grand scheme of things of tabletop role-playing games, it's not that different because there are not millions, but there are thousands of titles out there, from very small press independent games such as this one, all the way up to the big guys like Dungeons and Dragons, Pathfinder, etc., Savage Worlds, etc. And those guys, between all of those different games, there's a lot of similarities, as it should be. Dungeons and Dragons in 1974 with Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson, they sort of set the precedent, as we all know. Not to go into a gaming history lesson, but they set the general precedent of a game master, a storyteller, and referee, generally behind a screen, but not necessarily. And then anywhere from two, maybe even sometimes one, a solo campaign, solo session as we call it, but usually 2 to 5, 6, sometimes 7, maybe 8 other players playing what we call player characters. So the player characters are precisely that. They are players that are playing characters. They are the protagonist of the story, and the game master, or in D&D they call it a dungeon master. In Savage Kingdoms we just call it game master, which is the more generic term, where that person is the narrator, the storyteller, the referee. They are called the game master because they have mastered, well, theoretically, have mastered the rules, at least for the most part. They know what's going on. Hopefully they should know at least 80% of the rules, in my opinion. Enough to where you don't really have to look them up during a game session, although using my 10-second rule, if you got to look something up, make sure it's only 10 seconds, otherwise make a decision to move on, and then you can figure out what the official rule was after the session. So that general setup of tabletop role-playing game, usually it's with dice. 98, 90, I'd say 99% of tabletop role-playing games use dice. Reason it's not 100%. There's some games like Amber, diceless role-playing, that actually don't use dice. They may use a card system or maybe just a pure descriptive system. In combat, I think there's a flashcard system in that game and maybe some others. But probably 99.5% of the time, dice are rolled as your action resolution mechanic, is the fancy term. So D20s are like the most famous, and I'll get to that even more in a second. But D6s are used a lot, and even more so in most tabletop role-playing games. There's a couple famous systems. D10s are pretty much always just used. But still, even though the D6 is historically by far the most popular die ever used in gambling and gaming and whatever, probably in nerdier tabletop fantasy role-playing, or in even science fiction and other genres, but particularly fantasy, the D20, the 20-sided die, is the most famous, made famous by Dungeons and Dragons. And Savage Kingdoms uses it too, but I'll get on that in a second because I have an order of things I want to go through. So now the things that are different. So what is different about Savage Kingdoms than other tabletop role-playing games, you ask? Well, I'll tell you. Number one, I would say it's sword and sorcery. Most tabletop role-playing games are set in kind of a quasi medieval or high Middle Ages setting, and some even bordering on early Renaissance. Dungeons & Dragons is a good example of that, and Pathfinder and a lot of other games too, but just to pick on that one for a second. Not really pick on it, because I really like it as well. So I've chosen with Savage Kingdoms to take a Dark Ages approach because if you're familiar with the sword and sorcery subgenre of fantasy, because it is a subgenre, my preferred subgenre or genre of fantasy, honestly, everything's more antiquated, typically set in a more ancient period. That way it connects more to mysticism, it's more mystical, there's less things that people can look up, so that's the appeal. It's harder to go to the internet and go, well, back in 218 BC that didn't exist. It's like, well, there's not as much record about that, and secondly, it's my own fantasy setting, so I can kind of do whatever. But I shouldn't actually speak to that because I'm actually one of those type that prefers things to be grounded and connected historically, if it can. But anyway, it is medieval fantasy after all, not just fantasy, so it does connect to a medieval. But Sword and Sorcery connects is, even though it's would be considered, I guess, medieval fantasy, it's really Dark Ages fantasy, or set in that sort of era, or an age of antiquity, or what we now call the Classical Age. Sometimes the Bronze Age is great, Iron Age. What was the old series popular back in the late 70s, early 80s? Clan of the Cave Bear, I think. That was set more in a Ice Age, or just after that. I think it was the end of the Ice Age, because that was the main overarching thing going on, and then the drama happened within. So that's a good example of going even further back, way back. So Sword and Sorcery does that. It typically is set in a world very much like our own, and often it is our own. And the most famous representation of Sword and Sorcery clearly is Robert E. Howard, who designed the character of Kull, and far more popularly, Conan. So Conan the Cimmerian, or Conan the Barbarian, as some people call him, Conan of Cimmeria was the epitome of the sword sorcery hero or anti-hero. And that's another good thing about sword and sorcery that's interesting. A lot of the heroes are not the shiny, lawful good types. They are typically what we would call anti-heroes. They're still protagonists, and you still kind of root for them because they're still doing cool things, and they still might do some moral and things as well. But they do typically have a code of honor. It might not be what we consider like Judeo-Christian morality necessarily, but it's what we would call tribal morality or tribal ethics. So that's another cool thing about sword and sorcery is, and that's definitely in Savage Kingdoms, is that there's not really a grand sweeping umbrella of what's good and evil. Each tribe or nationality sort of has its own. There's some grounded things that I think we all know as human beings. Don't kill your own, don't kill your brother. You'll be a kinslayer, because that was bad. And the reason it was bad is because you needed everyone in your tribe. You didn't want to kill your own people because you had to survive the winter. You had to go out and hunt. You had to fight off other tribes. So that's where tribal morality exists. It's like Savage Kingdoms. Every culture has a code of honor system that you don't have to adhere to, but it does give a player kind of like an alignment in Dungeons & Dragons. Kind of some points you may want to hit on. It kind of helps with your role playing. And if you really do adhere to it, every other advancement you get like a bonus from your GM. But anyway, check that out. So that's another cool thing about Sword and Sorcery. I personally like Sword and Sorcery is my favorite subgenre. High fantasy is kind of the other. I mean, there's a bunch of other, urban fantasy, etc. But high fantasy is probably it is the most popular. It was made popular by J.R.R. Tolkien, of course, and then various authors after him. But he's the one that first established that back in the late 30s with The Hobbit, and then back in the early 50s with the Lord of the Rings, which was his grand opus, in my opinion. And that's where good and evil are more palpable. You're fighting against the Dark Lord or something. These band of heroes kind of come together. They're generally honorable and probably moral. Some of them may have some issues, like Boromir, was corrupted by the ring, stuff like that. But in general, they're Well, because the other title for high fantasy is heroic fantasy. They're kind of your typical hero types, kind of shining knights in armor, so to speak. Sword and sorcery, you don't really quite get that as much, and you don't have the grand arcing of the Dark Lord. You're not really saving the world off. In fact, some of the stories, you're just trying to assassinate this horrible person, or you're trying to steal this great treasure from this ancient temple guarded by some demon or giant spider or something. So it's more sort of grounded. That's a term I've used before in past videos, and in general is, in fact, I think I even write about it in the Savage Kingdom's core rulebook, the third edition one, but grounded fantasy. Game of Thrones is a good example. George R.R. Martin, he's writing, he's straddling genres. I mean, most people would probably classify it as high fantasy because in the end of his arc, it is kind of high fantasy because magical elements are coming back. But at the beginning of the book, it's, can't say it's historical fantasy because it didn't actually happen, but it's very similar to that. And there's some sword and sorcery elements, is particularly when you get over in Essos, the Dothraki stuff, it gets very sword and sorcery feeling, and then it gets back. And there's some dark fantasy is another subgenre that just often kind of crosses into sword and sorcery. You get some dark fantasy elements from that as well. So as you can see, there are different subgenres of fantasy. So Savage Kingdoms, to make it different from most other games, which are set more in high fantasy, is mostly a sword and sorcery genre. Before I finish that point, though, to that end, when I first self-published the game in 2014, as you can tell, here's the logo, by the way. Some of you have probably seen it before, but in case you haven't, the reason I'm showing that logo is that shows you that it was inspired by sword and sorcery. You can see the font is actually a very Conan type font that they use in a lot of the Conan marketing. And you can see the horned helmet and the two crossed battle axes. So that kind of is an indication that, yeah, this is going to be a fairly gritty kind of sword and sorcery game. And it is. However, as I went through the 1.5 edition or the second edition, the Reforged edition, it started getting a little bit away from that, not much, but a little. And then third edition, maybe somewhat a little bit more, but then in some ways kind of went back to the original. Anyway, I guess my point is that it's still technically sword and sorcery. I mean, it even says heroic sword and sorcery role-playing game, and that's actually why we came up with that sort of subtitle, because heroic is almost a term for high fantasy, and sword and sorcery is its own thing. So we came up with a title, or maybe it's just me, but somebody, heroic sword and sorcery, meaning that it's sword and sorcery, but you can also play it very heroic style. Whereas, like I said, the typical sword and sorcery characters are sort of anti-heroes almost. Not always, but usually. So look, you could play, a little more heroic version, but just know that the overall setting is still very somewhat antiquated. Things are very mysterious. The gods may not even really exist. The point is that faith in the gods is where the power comes from. So there might be a priest who preaches all day and claims his mystical powers come from this god, but at the end of the day, he probably doesn't care. It's just the fact that he knows how to use these powers, not only magical powers, but he probably has great social power within his culture. So it doesn't really necessarily matter whether the gods exist. So that's another thing of sword and sorcery. Or if they do exist, they're often very dark, Cthulhian sort of things. Because, Robert E. Howard, kind of the grandfather of sword and sorcery, with his Conan stories particularly, befriended H.P. Lovecraft. They were pen pals, and they wrote back and forth. And Howard eventually started using Lovecraft's Cthulhian sort of mythos, not directly, but definitely borrowed from the flavor of that. And so that's why in some of the later Conan stories, you get some of the tentacled dark creatures that come from between the stars. And that stuff is really cool. That really, honestly, that really put the icing on the cake of sword and sorcery for me and for a lot of fans, I think. So that's how Savage Kingdoms is different, mostly in atmosphere and tone. Number 2, how is it different? The single D20. So it's a dice resolution system. Like I mentioned, that means it's not different hardly at all. But I guess one thing that makes it kind of different, it uses a single D20. For example, Dungeons & Dragons, Pathfinder, and some other dungeon crawl class, some other games that are derivative of those, quite literally in some cases, they use a D20, but they also use D4s, D6s, D8, D10, and D12s, like Dungeons & Dragons does. And that's really cool. Those types of dice are awesome and cool, and I still really love D&D and 5th edition particularly, and the earlier editions. But when designing Savage Kingdoms, I realized that, and I played so much D&D in the past, that sometimes the dice were a little too overwhelming, and they sometimes what we call in the acting industry pulling focus. They pulled pulling focus from the actual story, the actual game. As cool as they were, but that's why they were so cool. Sometimes people are so fascinated with the dice, or they're stacking them and all this stuff, and it's like the game's not really about the dice, it's about the story. The dice are just tools to help tell the story. So with a single D20 system, you can get away from some of the confusion, particularly some of the new players in D&D and some of the younger players, not just that they're young, but newer players. Is this my D8 or is this my D10? The D8s and D10s, they can't really tell right off the bat. And then and on top of that, you have the 1D20 roll, and then suddenly it disconnects to the dice pool that you're rolling with different types of dice, and that kind of slows the game down some. So one of the conscious efforts I wanted to make was just to use a single D20 and make it count more. Another thing I guess that bothered me in D&D or Pathfinder would be like, I got a 28. It's like, well, it doesn't matter. The armor classes, you went well over it. There was no benefit for it. You could score 14 points over what you needed to hit, and then suddenly you roll 1 point of damage. So there was a big disconnect there. So I wanted to connect the two narratively, story-wise, and also mechanically. So single D20 system. So combat's probably the best example of that, how it works. Is you in Dungeons & Dragons, you would make a attack roll or a 2-hit roll, and then separate it into the damage roll, like I just said. So in Savage Kingdoms, in SK, you roll a single D20, and whether you succeed in scoring damage or not on the opponent, it's all in one roll. So your damage and your attack roll is all figured on the one. If you get a natural 20, it explodes, and you get to roll. You add up your result. You get to roll. You roll D20 again, and add that raw result to that. If you get another 20, an exploding 20, then you get to roll again. It keeps going. Obviously, it's hard to get usually more than 1 or 2, or sometimes 3, because it's only a 5% chance of rolling a 20. So if you score 20 over what you need, you get a critical success. And what you need, the target number is called a difficulty level, DL. D&D, I think it's a DC difficulty class, so it's very similar. I just didn't want to steal the terminology directly. The terminology. So if you get 20 over what you need, you critically succeed in what you were doing. And then there's in the book there's a list of effects that you can either roll randomly or decide what happens. And then if you score a 0, if you get a modified 0, and you can, say if you have -2 in something, and you're say, oh, I'm going to make an alchemy roll, but I'm -2 at it, and you roll a 2, and you get -2, and you got a 0. So 0 or less result is a critical failure. There's 2 ways critical fail. That second one is if you get it score natural 1, and your modified result is 10 less than what you need. Say you need a 15, and you roll a 1, and you're +3 in something. You got a 4, so you critically failed because you failed it by 11. So a natural 1 failing with a total result failing by 10 or more is or 10 or less is or 10 or more is a critical failure and a modified 0. So even though there's 2 ways to critically fail, only 1 way to critically succeed, being 20 over what you need, there's still slightly more, critical failures are still a little more rare because it's mathematically harder to do that. And if you play the game, you'll see what I'm talking about. So single D20 system, it makes the game run faster. That was the whole game, the design goal behind that. Now, I will confess now, in the early editions of Savage Kingdoms, the numbers were higher, and so it didn't necessarily faster. It wasn't necessarily faster because you had to do a little more head math. So one design goal adjustment I made in Savage Kingdoms 3 was to lower the math. So now head math is a lot quicker. I mean, if you need to use a calculator, it's fine. It's just all very basic. But most people can, because you're only adding like +5 or something, maybe +7 or 8 or yeah. And maybe there's a subtraction of, okay, I scored 22 over a defensive 15, then you just have to go, oh, that's 7. 7 base points of damage, modified by your weapon type. Do you have armor piercing 1? Did 8 points of damage, minus the guy's armor. There you go, done. That's just combat. Okay, so number 3. Savage Kingdoms is not a class-based system, asterisk. And the reason I say asterisk, or quote, I don't know why I did quotes for an asterisk. I guess they represent the same thing almost in some ways. So Dungeons & Dragons and a lot of fantasy role-playing game have classes, right? You choose to be a fighter, or a wizard, or a rogue, or a ranger, or a barbarian, or whatever. So originally in Savage Kingdoms, first edition and the Reforged edition, we had life paths, but they were just suggestive. So you could choose, like, here's how I would build an assassin. This is how I would build a bard or a sorcerer or a temple priest or something, which is all well and good, but you could still build whatever you want to. It's completely open. So now in third, what I've learned is that, and I kind of knew this before, and a lot of people would agree with this, fantasy connects more to class-based systems, and it may be because of the computer games that have come after Dungeons and Dragons, but I think it originally starts with the Fellowship of the Ring and with and Tolkien. It's like you got your 9 people, and you can go. That's the archer. That's the ranger, literally. That's the wizard, literally. One of the Astari. That's kind of the hobbits are kind of roguey thief types. Bilbo literally was a burglar, or so the dwarves called him that from the Hobbit. So I decided with third edition, we now have this is the reason for the asterisk, is that it's not a class-based system, but we have things now called callings in Savage Kingdoms. A calling is a, kind of like it says, something you're called to be, something maybe you're destined to be, or maybe your skills kind of aim that way, or your talents. So, and they're now mechanical, and there's 20 of them. They run from assassin to berserker to craftsman to merchant, sorcerer, seer, berserker, merchant. I think I already said, yeah, there's a bunch of them. 20 of them, in fact. Scout, thief, or hunter. So when you choose one of those, they give you some mechanical bonuses, unlike the life paths used to. So you get favored talents, meaning you pay 1 point less for that. So if you choose a talent that's favored for your calling, you pay a point less for it. So if you end up choosing 3 or 4 talents at character creation that are from your calling, you can save a couple points there and start off with more talents. So yeah, that's how you do it mechanically. And also favored weaknesses. If you choose a weakness that's a drawback, a weakness that's more indicative of that calling, then you'll get a bonus point for it. So and those points transfer into getting more talents or more skills, or both. Without going completely into the details. So yeah, callings, not classes. So we have that. Also, the cool thing is that in Savage Kingdoms 3, you don't have to choose a calling. So the old way of doing it is still there. You can literally go, I'm not going to really choose a calling. I'm just going to build kind of whatever character. The drawback is mechanically, you'll probably miss out on a few points because you don't get your favorite talents. You don't get favorite weaknesses. And another thing about callings too that I skip, you get to start off with several skills automatically, and then you get some skill points left over to kind of either increase those or spend in some other skills. I think there are 28 skills now in the game. So that's another thing about class. So if you don't choose a calling, you don't get those benefits, unfortunately. I guess the benefit is that you can kind of spend freely. And if you like the older version of Savage Kingdom. So it's not a class-based system, but it kind of also is at the same time. So that kind of makes it a little different, I think. Number 4, races and cultures. So this is kind of 2 parts. So races and cultures mean more, I think, in Savage Kingdoms than some of the other games. And this is a game designer thing that's kind of come up over the last 10, 15 years, is making, and it goes back to Dungeons & Dragons. So in Dungeons & Dragons and other games, similarly, you start off with you choose your race. I want to be an elf or a human or a dwarf or whatever. And you get some cool little abilities for that race. But then you start with that and they never increase, they never scale up or whatever. There's some ways around it, like 3.5 edition D&D, and then I think 4th did like racial feats. So you could, like, whenever you got a feat, you could take a racial one, and it kind of boosts some of your racial abilities. So there are kind of ways around it, but in general, it's all front loaded, as we would call it. So in Savage Kingdoms, your race or culture actually gives you favored talents, just like your talent, and that applies through all advancements, not just a character creation. So if you're building your character, it applies to character creation. Say you make advancement 1, you look back at your racial stuff, that still applies to you. You can still, I'm going to choose this talent because it's a favorite one of my race. I pay 1 point less. If it happens to be a favored one also of your calling, you pay 2 points less. So nice little note there. No talent can be reduced more than 2 talent points. And I know I said this probably in another video, but There it is again. Yeah, so it means a little bit more, and each race and culture start with a couple other little special abilities. Those typically don't really scale up. So, but the fact that every advancement your favorite talents and still apply is really nice. Okay, this B part of that, the sub part of that, is that so because Savage Kingdoms is very sword and sorcery based, it's very human centric. So, in fact, non-human races are actually optional in Savage Kingdoms. I wrote it that way specifically to cater more to the sword and sorcery field, where pretty much all the antagonists in sword and sorcery stories are human. However, they come from very rich cultures. So, the fact that you're human, that's kind of boring, right? It doesn't really tell much about the character. But is he from a Viking culture? Is he from an Arabic culture? Is he from a sea-based culture? Is he from a desert culture? That's awesome and very important. So to that end, Savage Kingdoms, the setting has a lot of rich cultures, just like Robert E. Howard had in the Hyborian Age, his setting for Conan, etc. So races and cultures mean more in that way too. So when you choose to be human, it's not a throwaway. It's like, oh, I'm just a boring human. It's like, well, no, are you Malovian? Gives you some different little mechanical things and also a different mind approach, how you're going to play the character probably. Each race and culture has its own code of honor thing that you can follow. There is no alignment, so that's different from like Dungeons and Dragons. But instead, Savage Kingdoms has like a code of honor thing that you can follow. You don't have to, but it's kind of a nice little outline. Each race and culture has one. And if you join an elite order, like certain priesthoods or the Company of the Black Lion or a Shadow Hand or something, each one of those also has tenets or codes that you might want to follow. Those are usually stricter. If you don't follow some of those, you can get kicked out or even ritually executed or so. If it's so kind of fun, but also be careful. Right. So that's the races and cultures meaning more. So number 5, skill-based magic and sorcery. Almost didn't want to do this one, but I hear this come up a lot in like game design conversation. And what people are referring to, I think, is that in D&D, it set a precedent for Vancian magic, where it's fire and forget magic, and it always works though. So there's not a skill. Well, actually, let me take that back. 5th edition D&D, sometimes you have to make a spell attack roll, but it's assumed the spell's still working because you lose the spell slot, spell energy. It just may not hit its target, or it may get resisted. But in any case, there's usually not a spell roll unless it's like a spell attack roll. The opponent may have to make a saving throw or something, or resistance roll, as we call it in Savage Kingdoms. So in Savage Kingdoms, it's skill-based. So the magical arts are 7 disciplines of magic: air, earth, fire, water, life, death, and shadow. And it's on your skill sheet, so you make a skill roll just like anything else. So when you cast a spell, if you don't hit the difficulty level you need, the spell, quote, doesn't work. But however, what's actually happening, described in the book, is this spell doesn't manifest correctly. It always works. Something happens, and the reason it's backed up, if you look at the critical failure roll, there's some things that are happening. So obviously, something's happening when you attempt a spell. But if you don't do it right, if you don't command it right, then it doesn't manifest correctly. But it is doing something, and that's why you lose the full stamina points. So that's how it's explained in Savage Kingdoms. So whether the spell works or not, you still spend the full stamina. Whereas in previous editions, if the spell failed to work or manifest incorrectly, you only spent half the stamina. So this time I wanted to make it more, because it's easier on the math. That was another thing that slowed the previous games down. It's like, okay, I was supposed to have been 3 stamina, but since it didn't work, it's round 1.5, round down to 1, so I only spent 1. Not a super big deal, but it did slow things down. So now in the new SK3, it's you spend the full stamina whether the spell worked or not. And you do start with a little bit more stamina than you used to, so don't worry, it actually kind of balances out. And also makes it far more interesting and the math a lot easier. So yeah, magic is skill-based. If you do a spell as a ritual, you get a +2 bonus. There's some sort of mystical, magical components listed. If you happen to have one of those, it's a +3 bonus. So it's all listed in the spell description. It's very cool. Maybe you have the scale of a dragon, or a vial of dragon blood or vampire's blood or something, and you'll look at the spell description. It might say that if you have this item, it gives you another +1 boost when performing a ritual. rituals take an hour. So they're more going way back, even more ancient world where rites and ceremonies were generally were a long time. I mean, maybe they were only a few minutes, but a lot of them are described as some, it seems like hours sometimes. So yeah. Number 6, the last thing that we're at 30 minutes is great. So this is thing kind of added on. So I was just going to do 5, but I added this thing on at the end, 6. So Savage Kingdoms is a small indie game, a small independent game. And what that means in game design jargon is that there are the big corporations, such as Hasbro, Wizard of the Coast, Paizo, etc. They produce Dungeons & Dragons, Pathfinder, respectively. Those are kind of like your big ones. There's a few others that are moderate, like White Wolf Publishing and Green Ronin, I guess, they're kind of small to medium. Whereas Savage Kingdoms and a lot of other sort of self-published or maybe purchased by a really tiny company games are considered small independent games. So it's generally just one person, such as myself, maybe a small group of 3 or 4 people. I do kind of have a group that helped me. I guess it's really just me that kind of owns the company. There's just other people kind of help, usually for free, unless it's a Kickstarter project where we raise enough where I can pay them to do the editing or the graphic design or whatever it is that they contribute. But my playtesters have all playtested for free. They get the rules for free, which is cool, at least the PDF, and they get to help create, which is great, and give feedback, but they're not really paid per se. So that's what I mean by a small independent game. Savage Kingdoms is that. We need all the help we can get, so back this project if you can. At the very least, if you don't and it makes and we're able to get the book out, it'll be for sale on Amazon.com probably. At the very least, Drive Through RPG, which I've sold, has the past editions on. At least support it there if you're not able to Kickstarter or Indiegogo on. Anyway, you know what I mean. Crowd, because we tried a Kickstarter, now we're on Indiegogo, so the terminology is still in my head. So yeah. So it's a small independent game like a lot of them, but as opposed to like a big sort of corporate game. And I guess that's it. So those were the main, originally top 5, but actually top 6 differences, how Savage Kingdoms is different from other tabletop role-playing games. Thanks, you guys, for watching the video this far. Subscribe and like and tell people about it. There's only a few people watching these things, so which is fine, but I'd like to kind of grow it a little bit and sort of get the word out there about the game, and you guys can help me do that. That would be awesome. All right, well, otherwise, I'll talk to you guys next time. Stay safe, stay sane, and talk to you soon.